A curvy bride climbed into a stranger's black car to escape her own wedding. She thought it was a rideshare, but she was wrong. The man behind the wheel knew was the city's most ruthless mafia boss and knew her groom's darkest secret. And now she couldn't get out. The veil was the first thing she tore off. Cassidy stood in the bridal suite of the Lake Geneva resort, staring at her reflection in the tall mirror. The morning light came soft through the curtains, painting gold across the lace of her gown. In 20 minutes, she was supposed to walk down an aisle lined with white roses and become Mrs. Brandon Cole. She smiled at herself, nervous and happy, and decided to find him, just for a second, just to calm the flutter in her chest before everyone's eyes were on her. The hallway behind the garden room was empty. She heard Brandon's voice through the half-open door and slowed, ready to surprise him. Then she heard the laughter of his groomsmen, and something in their tone made her stop. "Be honest," one of them said. "You actually into her, or is this about the deal?" Brandon laughed, that easy golden laugh she had fallen for 2 years ago. "Come on, look at her family's company. 3 generations, national retail accounts, factories that actually turn a profit. My business is bleeding out and nobody knows it yet. The day I sign that marriage license, I'm tied into the Lane family name. Investors love a clean love story." He paused. "She's a sweet girl, a little soft around the middle, sure, but softness comes with a very nice inheritance." The men chuckled. Brandon kept going, lighter now, crueler. "Trust me, I'll learn to love the bank account." Cassidy's hand pressed flat against the wall. The hallway tilted. Every kind word he'd ever whispered rearranged itself in her mind into something with sharp edges. The flowers, the proposal, the way he'd asked about her father's business on their 3rd date. All of it. She backed away before she could hear more. She didn't cry. There wasn't time, and somehow the shock pushed the tears down somewhere deeper, somewhere she couldn't reach yet. She moved through the service corridor in a daze, gown hissing against the floor, until she found a side exit that opened onto the gravel drive at the front of the resort. Cars were everywhere, guests still arriving. Somewhere behind her, a bridesmaid called her name. "Cassidy? Cass, where'd you go?" She couldn't face them, couldn't stand in front of 300 people and explain that the groom had just confessed she was a transaction. She needed air, distance, anything. A black SUV sat idling near the entrance, engine humming, windows dark. A rideshare, she thought. It had to be. Someone had ordered a car and stepped away. She yanked the rear door open and climbed in, gathering the heavy skirt around her legs. "Please," she breathed, slamming the door. "Just drive. I don't care where. Away from here." The vehicle pulled away smoothly, tires crunching over gravel, and slid onto the main road. For a full minute, Cassidy just sat there, chest heaving, watching the resort shrink behind her through the rear window. The relief was so sharp it almost hurt. She'd done it. She was gone. Then she noticed the silence. There was no driver's app glowing on a dashboard mount, no little plastic phone holder, no air freshener swinging from the mirror. The leather under her hands was soft and cold and expensive. The whole car smelled like cedar and something darker, like rain on stone. And the man behind the wheel was not looking at a navigation screen. He was watching her in the rearview mirror. He was young, maybe 30, with dark hair and a jaw cut like he'd been carved out of something hard. His suit was charcoal, perfectly fitted, no tie. Along the left side of his neck, just above his collar, the edge of a tattoo crept up his skin in fine black lines. His eyes in the mirror were calm. Too calm. The eyes of a man who was very rarely surprised by anything and was, for once, mildly surprised. "You're sitting in my car," he said. His voice was low and even. In a wedding dress, Cassidy's stomach dropped through the floor. "You're not the driver," she whispered. "No." "Oh, no. Oh, no, I'm so sorry," I thought. "I'll get out. Just pull over." Please, I'll get out right here. On the highway, he didn't slow down. In that, she looked down at herself. Half a bridal gown, no shoes, mascara probably running, a stranger's car doing 70 down a county road. She had no phone, no purse, no plan. She'd left all of it in the suite. "Who are you?" she managed. He was quiet for a moment, easing the SUV into the left lane, passing a slow truck without effort. "Riker," he said. "Riker Vale Mercer. I just finished a meeting back at that resort." His eyes flicked to the mirror again. A private one. The kind people don't usually run into the middle of wearing white. Something in the way he said private made the hair on her arms stand up. "I really am sorry," she said it smaller now. "I just needed to leave, my fiancé. I overheard, it doesn't matter. I'll figure something out. You can drop me anywhere." Riker said nothing for a long stretch of road. Fields slid past the windows, green and endless. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted just slightly into something that felt less like surprise and more like calculation. "Cole," he said, "your fiancé." "Brandon Cole?" Cassidy froze. "How do you know that?" In the mirror, one corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. "Because that name," Riker said, "is the exact reason I was at that resort today." The SUV kept driving, carrying her away from one disaster and straight into the center of something she didn't yet understand. By the time the city lights of Chicago rose up ahead, Cassidy had stopped shaking. She'd spent the drive curled against the door, watching Riker more than the road. He hadn't tried to explain that last sentence. Every time she asked about Brandon, he'd just said, "Not while we're moving," and kept his eyes forward. The longer the silence stretched, the more her mind spun. It was nearly dark when the SUV slipped into an underground garage beneath a tall glass building downtown. A man in a gray suit was already waiting by the elevator. He didn't look at Cassidy twice, didn't react to the wedding gown at all, just held the doors and pressed a button without being told. The elevator rose for a long time. The suite at the top took her breath away, despite everything. Floor-to-ceiling windows, the whole skyline spread out below like a bowl of light. A low couch, a kitchen no one seemed to cook in. Fresh flowers she was sure had been placed there that afternoon. "There's a guest room through there," Riker said, loosening the top button of his collar. "Clothes that should fit. My assistant guessed your size from a photo online." Cassidy turned slowly. "A photo of me? From where?" "Your engagement announcement. It's everywhere right now." He picked up a tablet from the counter and held it out. "So is this?" She took it with careful fingers. The screen showed a gossip site, already updated. "Runaway bride at Lake Geneva. Iris vanishes minutes before vows." There was a photo of the empty altar, white roses, and 300 confused faces. Below it, a second headline, sharper. "Did Cole wedding hide a business secret?" Her hands tightened on the edges. "They're saying I had cold feet," she said. "They're making me look unstable." For now, Riker poured 2 glasses of water and set one near her. "By morning, Brandon will have a better story. He's good at stories." Cassidy set the tablet down. "You keep talking like you know him. I know what he's part of." Riker leaned against the counter, arms folded, the tattoo on his neck catching the low light. "Your fiancé has spent the last 2 years pulling money from a group of investors who are currently being looked at very closely, not by police, by people in my world who don't like being cheated." His voice stayed even. "These men find struggling family companies. They marry into them, partner with them, promise to save them. Then they strip everything of value and walk away clean before anyone realizes what happened." The water in Cassidy's stomach turned cold. "My family's company," she whispered. "Lane Retail. That's my guess. I don't have proof yet. But the meeting I had this morning at that resort was about Brandon's group. They were supposed to be there. They weren't. And then a bride fell into my back seat with his name on her lips." He shrugged one shoulder. I don't believe in luck, but I believe in timing. Cassidy sank onto the arm of the couch, the gown pulled around her, ridiculous and heavy. An hour ago, she'd thought the worst thing in the world was being married for money. Now a stranger was telling her the man she'd almost married might destroy the thing her grandfather had built with his hands. "Why are you telling me any of this?" she asked. "You could have dropped me at a gas station and never thought about me again." Riker studied her for a moment, the way someone studies a problem they haven't decided how to solve. "Because you know him better than anyone I've found so far," he said. 2 years close. You've seen his phone, his friends, his habits. You're a thread I didn't have this morning. He paused. "And because dropping a woman in a wedding dress at a gas station at night isn't something I do." She almost laughed at that, a small broken sound. "You're a criminal, aren't you?" "That meeting your world. You're not exactly a businessman." "I'm both," he said simply. "The line is thinner than people think." Cassidy looked out at the skyline. Somewhere far below, her parents were probably frantic. The resort was probably still buzzing. And Brandon was probably already deciding how to spin this in his favor. "I should go home," she said. "I should warn my family." "You can. Tonight, if you want, I'll have someone drive you." Riker set his glass down. "But think first. If you walk back in right now, you walk into 300 questions, a dozen reporters, and a man who will hug you in front of all of them and call it a misunderstanding. You won't get a single real answer. You'll just be the unstable bride again." She hated that he was right. "Or," he went on, "you stay out of sight a few days. Quietly. Let me show you what I find. If it's nothing, you go home knowing the truth and you never see me again. If it's something, then I'll know what I'm walking back into," she finished. Yes. The whole city hummed below the glass. Cassidy thought of Brandon's voice in that hallway, light and cruel. "I'll learn to love the bank account." She thought of her father, who trusted too easily, who'd called Brandon a fine young man at the rehearsal dinner. She turned back to Riker. "I don't trust you," she said. "Good, you shouldn't trust anyone today." "But I'm not going home yet." She lifted her chin. "Show me what you find, all of it." No half answers. Something flickered across his face. Respect, maybe. "Get changed," he said. "We start in the morning." Cassidy gathered the heavy skirt in both hands and walked toward the guest room, leaving the gown's long shadow trailing behind her on the polished floor. Cassidy didn't sleep much. She woke before sunrise in clothes that weren't hers, in a bed softer than any she'd ever owned, with the skyline already turning pale gold outside the glass. For a moment, she forgot everything. Then it all came back at once, and the weight of it pressed her flat against the pillows. She found Riker in the kitchen, already dressed, reading something on his tablet. He slid a coffee toward her without a word. "I need to go to my parents' house," she said. He looked up. "I thought you agreed to stay out of sight." "Out of sight of Brandon and the reporters? Not my own home." She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "My parents are out of town until tonight. Their anniversary trip. They left 2 days before the wedding and were flying back this afternoon to walk me down the aisle." Her voice caught on the last word. "The house will be empty. I want to see something with my own eyes before I believe any of this." Riker watched her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll have a car take you. One of my people goes with you and waits outside. That's the deal." She didn't argue. The drive up to the North Shore took less than an hour. The houses grew bigger and quieter, set back behind old trees, until the car turned into the long driveway she'd known her whole life, her childhood home. White columns, blue shutters, her mother's garden just starting to bloom. The man Riker stayed by the car, arms folded, as promised. Cassidy let herself in with the spare key from under the third flower pot, the same hiding place since she was 9. Inside, the house smelled like her mother's candles and her father's pipe tobacco. Wedding gifts were still stacked in the front hall, ribbons and silver paper, gifts for a marriage that would never happen now. She walked past them quickly. She went to her father's study. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She just knew Brandon had spent hours in this room over the last few months, talking business with her dad, laughing, pouring drinks. She'd thought it was sweet. The future son-in-law bonding with the father. The desk was tidy. Too tidy. Her father was a stacker, a man of comfortable mess, but the folders here were squared off and neat, the way someone leaves things when they want them to look untouched. She opened the top drawer. Inside was a leather portfolio she didn't recognize. She pulled it out, sat in her father's big chair, and opened it. The first pages were ordinary, company statements, the kind of thing she'd seen her whole life growing up around Lane retail. But folded behind them was a printed agreement, and her own name jumped out at her from the middle of a paragraph. She read it slowly, then read it again. It was a partnership proposal, a merger, really, dressed up in soft language. Upon the marriage of Cassidy Lane to Brandon Cole, Lane Retail would enter a strategic alliance with Cole Holdings. Brandon's company would gain access to Lane's factories, supplier contracts, and retail accounts. In exchange, Cole Holdings offered an investment that, when she traced the numbers, was almost nothing at all. A few signatures, and her family's 3 generations of work would be tied to a man who brought empty pockets and a good smile. At the bottom, in her father's handwriting, was a note. Wait until after the wedding. Don't want to upset Cass before her big day. Her father had known about the business side. Maybe not the worst of it. But he'd known the marriage and the merger were stitched together, and he'd kept it from her so she could enjoy being a bride. Cassidy set the portfolio down with shaking hands. It wasn't that her parents had plotted against her. She knew them too well to believe that. Her father had simply trusted Brandon the way he trusted everyone and let himself be talked into something that sounded like a blessing for both families. He'd seen a young man saving a struggling company through love. He hadn't seen the trap underneath. But Brandon had. Brandon had built the trap, paper by paper, dinner by dinner, while she picked out flowers and tasted cakes. She thought she might be sick. A buzzing pulled her back. There was a small television mounted in the corner of the study, left on mute, a morning show. And there, filling the screen, was Brandon. She grabbed the remote and turned up the sound. He sat in a soft chair across from a sympathetic host, dressed in muted gray, his eyes red as if he'd been crying. He spoke in a quiet, wounded voice about how confused he was, how worried, how he only wanted to know that Cassidy was safe. He called her my Cass. He said he forgave her for whatever fear had made her run. He asked the public to help bring her home. The host nearly wept. The screen flashed a number to call with tips. Cassidy stared at the man she'd almost married, watching him build sympathy out of her pain like it was just another deal. He was good. He was so good that for one dizzy second, even she almost believed him. Then she remembered the hallway. Softness comes with a very nice inheritance. She turned the television off. For a long while, she sat alone in her father's chair, holding the portfolio, the empty house ticking and settling around her. She'd come here hoping Riker was wrong, hoping she'd find nothing, hoping she could go home and pretend. Instead, she'd found proof in her own family's study, in her own father's handwriting. She picked up the leather folder, walked back through the hall of unopened gifts, and stepped out into the morning light where the car was waiting. She wasn't running anymore. Now she wanted answers. Riker read the portfolio twice without speaking. They were back in the Chicago suite, the leather folder open on the counter between them. Cassidy watched his eyes move across the pages, watched the small muscle tighten in his jaw when he reached her father's note at the bottom. "He hid it from you," Riker said finally. But he didn't hide it well. He's not part of the scheme. He's a target who didn't know he was being aimed at. That's almost worse, she said. My dad thought he was gaining a son. Riker closed the folder. This is good. It proves intent. But intent isn't a pattern, and a pattern is what brings men like Brandon down. One marriage, one merger, that's a love story gone wrong. A dozen of them is a crime. So we find the others. He looked at her. We? I'm not sitting in a glass tower waiting for you to bring me scraps. She pushed the folder toward him. You said I'm a thread you didn't have. Fine, use me, but I go where you go. Something settled in his expression. Not surprised this time, agreement. There's a man in Indianapolis, he said. A retired accountant named Walter Boyd. He spent 15 years working the books for the investors Brandon runs with. He left 2 years ago, quietly, and dropped off the map. People who leave that group quietly usually know something. Then let's go to Indianapolis. They drove down the next morning, a long stretch of flat highway and gray sky. Cassidy expected the silence to be heavy, the way it had been on that first ride. It wasn't. Somewhere along the road they started talking, small things at first. She asked how he ended up in his world. He gave half an answer about a father who owed the wrong people and a debt that got passed down like an heirloom. She told him about her grandfather building Lane Retail out of a single fabric shop, sewing the first samples himself. By the time they reached Indianapolis, the silence between them had turned into something easier. Walter Boyd lived in a small brick house on a street of identical small brick houses. He answered the door in a cardigan, suspicious, half hidden behind the chain. He had the careful eyes of a man who'd spent years expecting the wrong knock. I don't talk about old work, he said. We're not here about old work, Cassidy said before Riker could speak. I'm here because I almost married one of them. Brandon Cole. The old man went still. His eyes moved over her face, the simple clothes, the absence of any threat. Then they moved to Riker, and a flicker of recognition crossed them, followed by fear. He's not here to hurt you, Cassidy said quickly. Neither am I. I just need to understand what I walked into. Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then the chain slid back and the door opened. The inside of the house smelled like old paper and coffee. He sat them at a small kitchen table and made tea he didn't drink. For a while he said nothing, turning a spoon over and over in his fingers. I kept the books, he said at last. For a long time I told myself it was just numbers. Then I started to see what the numbers meant. He set the spoon down. They have a method. They find a company that's healthy but family-run. Family means trust, and trust means doors that open without paperwork. They send someone in, a partner, sometimes a husband. He glanced at Cassidy. The marriage isn't the prize. The marriage is the key. Once they're family, the contracts come easy. Then they borrow against the company, drain the value, and move the debt around until the original owners are left holding nothing but the name. Cassidy's tea went cold in her hands. How many companies? In my time, 6 that I knew of. A textile maker in Ohio, a trucking family in Tennessee, a grocery chain, a few others. His voice dropped. Good people. People who thought they'd gained a son or a partner. By the time they understood, the money was gone, and the marriage was already falling apart on purpose, so the man could walk away clean and call himself the victim. The word landed hard. Victim. She thought of Brandon on the morning show, red-eyed, asking the public to bring his Cass home. Do you have records? Riker asked, his voice low and steady. Walter's hands tightened. I have nothing. I burned my copies years ago. I was afraid. He looked down. But I remember a name, the man who handled the worst of it. The one who kept the real ledger, the second set of books that showed where everything actually went. They called him the investor. I never met him, but every deal ran through him. A name, Riker pressed gently. I only ever heard one, Harlan. Walter shook his head. That's all. Harlan kept the ledger. Find the ledger, and you find all of it. Without it, you have stories. And stories don't stop men like that. Cassidy leaned forward. The trucking family in Tennessee. Do you remember anything? A town, a name? Walter thought. Nashville, he said slowly. The husband bragged about Nashville. That's where the man who ruined them is supposed to have set up after. Restaurants, real estate, made himself respectable. Riker and Cassidy exchanged a glance. Riker's businesses were in Nashville. His world and Brandon's world had a place where they touched. They thanked Walter and stood to leave. At the door, the old man caught Cassidy's sleeve. You ran, he said softly. That was smart. The ones who don't run get swallowed. His grip loosened. Don't stop now, they count on people stopping. Outside, the gray sky had begun to clear. Cassidy got into the SUV and stared at the little brick house in the mirror as they pulled away. Harlan, she said. The ledger. Nashville. Riker nodded, eyes on the road. Then Nashville's where we go next. For the first time since the hallway, since the cruel laugh and the white roses, Cassidy felt something other than grief. She felt the chase. Cassidy went to Nashville expecting to learn more about the enemy. Instead, she learned about Riker. They flew down on a small private plane, and from the moment they landed, the city seemed to know him. Not the way a wanted man is known, the way a respected one is. The driver who met them shook his hand warmly. A woman at the hotel desk asked about his mother. Somewhere between Chicago and Tennessee, the cold man from the back of the SUV had turned into someone people were glad to see. You said you were both, Cassidy remembered as they drove through the bright downtown. Businessman, and the other thing, I only met the other thing. Riker's mouth twitched. You met me on a bad morning. The first stop was a restaurant he owned, a warm place with brick walls and the smell of slow-cooked everything. The staff lit up when he walked in. An older cook came out of the kitchen, still in her apron, took both his hands, and scolded him for not visiting sooner. Riker, who had barely smiled in 3 days, smiled at her like a son. Cassidy watched from a corner booth, confused and a little disarmed. That's Miss Ada, he said when he sat down across from her. She cooked here when it was failing. 3 owners came and went. I bought it, kept her, kept the whole staff. Now it's full every night. He shrugged. People think this world is all takeovers. Most of what I do is keep things from falling apart. And the meeting at the resort, the one I crashed, his face cooled just slightly. Some things in my world aren't gentle. I won't pretend they are. But I don't ruin families. I clean up after the men who do. He looked at her steadily. There's a difference between a man with hard edges and a man with no floor. A man with no floor. She thought of Brandon, smiling on television. Over the next 2 days, she saw the rest of it. He took her to a building site where his company was turning an abandoned mill into apartments. He knew the foreman's kids' names. At a community center across the river, children ran up to him in a gym his money had rebuilt, and he caught a basketball one of them threw and sank it without looking, to a roar of delight. She kept waiting for the mask to slip, for the real Riker to show himself as something darker. It never came, or maybe this was the real Riker, and the man in the SUV had just been the armor. That evening they ate on a quiet rooftop, just the 2 of them, the city glowing below. Why do you do it? She asked. The chasing. Men like Brandon. You could just run your restaurants and your buildings and live a clean life. Riker turned his glass slowly. My father lost everything to a man like that. Same method. A friendly partner who smiled while he emptied us out. My mother worked 2 jobs after. My father never recovered. His voice stayed level, but something old moved behind it. I climbed into this world to survive it. Then I decided that if I had to be in it, I'd point it at the right people. Cassidy was quiet. She'd spent 2 years with a man who hid an empty heart behind a warm face. Now she sat across from a man who hid a warm heart behind a hard one. "You're not what I assumed," she admitted. "No," he said, "and neither are you. I expected a runaway bride. I got someone who walked into her father's study and pulled the truth out of a drawer." Heat rose in her cheeks. She looked away, out at the lights. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've earned a question. When you heard him in that hallway, what hurt most?" She thought about it honestly. "I always knew people saw me a certain way. The bigger girl, the soft one, the heiress who should be grateful anyone noticed her." She swallowed. "I let Brandon make me feel chosen. Like he saw past all of that. The worst part wasn't that he didn't love me. It was finding out he'd used the exact thing I was most afraid of. He weaponized my own doubt." Riker was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "He was wrong about you, about all of it." It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't a line. It was just true the way he said it, and that made it land harder than any compliment ever had. That night, in her hotel room, Cassidy couldn't sleep again, but it was a different kind of restless now. She kept thinking about Miss Ada's hands around his, the basketball arcing into the net, the level way he'd said he was wrong about you. She'd come into this terrified and grieving. Somewhere along the road, between Indianapolis and Nashville, the fear had started to change shape. She still didn't fully trust Riker. She wasn't foolish, but she no longer thought he'd hurt her. She thought, maybe, he might be the only person in her life who wasn't trying to use her for something. In the morning, Riker was already up, his face set hard again, the soft Nashville version of him put carefully away. He held up his phone. "It's Brandon," he said. She sat up. "What about him? He's not waiting for you to come home anymore." Riker turned the screen toward her. "He's going on the attack." The headline glared back at her. "Runaway Heiress spotted with mystery man. Was there someone else all along?" Below it was a grainy photo. Her and Riker on a Nashville sidewalk, standing too close, caught mid-law. Cassidy stared at the image of herself looking happy and felt the chase turn, suddenly, into a war. The photo spread faster than the truth ever could. By noon it was on every gossip site, every morning show, every feed Cassidy refused to look at but couldn't escape. The story wrote itself the way Brandon wanted it to. The grieving fiancé, abandoned at the altar, now wounded a second time by proof that his bride had run straight into another man's arms. He gave a new interview that afternoon, and this time he didn't cry. He played hurt and noble instead, voice cracking at all the right moments. "I kept hoping she was just scared," he told the camera. "I defended her. I asked people to help bring her home, and now I find out she was never confused at all. She just chose someone else and let me look like a fool in front of 300 people." He looked down, jaw tight. "I forgive her, I do. But I think the public deserves to know who Cassidy Lane really is." The damage was instant. Cassidy's phone, which Riker had finally returned to her with a new number, filled with messages from people who'd seen the story. 2 boutiques that carried her small fashion line called to pause their orders. A magazine that had planned to feature her quietly canceled. Her grandmother's name, the Lane name, the thing 3 generations had built, was being dragged through a story Brandon had written from a hospital of his own imagination. She sat on the floor of the Chicago suite, back against the couch, staring at nothing. "I can't fight this," she said quietly. "He's better at it than I'll ever be. He's been lying his whole life. I've been telling the truth for 3 days and I'm already losing." Riker crouched in front of her. "You're losing because you're playing his game, hiding, letting him narrate. Every hour you stay quiet, he writes another chapter. So what do I do? Post a photo of the documents? They'll say, I forged them. He'll cry on television again, and everyone will believe him. Then don't fight him from behind a screen." Riker held her gaze. "Stand up in front of all of them, in daylight. Say it with your own face and your own voice. He can twist a photo. He can't twist you looking the world in the eye and telling the truth. She shook her head. I'm not like him. I freeze in front of cameras. You walked into Walter Boyd's house and got a frightened man to open up in 5 minutes, Riker said. You pulled the truth out of your father's desk when you wanted it to be a lie. You're not a woman who freezes. You're a woman who's been told to be small for so long she believes it. The words went through her like a current. She thought about the hallway again, about being soft, being grateful, being chosen, about a lifetime of shrinking so other people felt comfortable. And she thought about how tired she was of letting Brandon hold the pen. All right, she said. A press event, a real one. My voice. Riker nodded once. I'll keep my name out of it. The less I'm in the story, the more it stays about him and you, where you belong. She looked at him, surprised. Disappearing was the opposite of what she'd expected from a man with his pride. You'd step back, she said, even though it's your investigation too. It stopped being only mine a while ago, he said, and he stood and got to work making the arrangements. She held the event the next morning on the steps of a Chicago building in a simple navy dress, no stylist, no script in her hand. Reporters came expecting a scandal. A few looked almost disappointed to find a calm woman instead of a crying one. Cassidy stepped to the small cluster of microphones, took a breath, and looked straight into the cameras. My name is Cassidy Lane, she said. 3 days ago, minutes before my wedding, I overheard my fiancé tell his friends that he was marrying me for my family's company. Not for me. For our factories, our accounts, our name. Her voice stayed steady. I didn't run because I was scared, or confused, or in love with someone else. I ran because I finally heard the truth. A murmur moved through the reporters. Since then, I've learned that I wasn't the first, she went on. Brandon Cole and the people he works with have done this before. They find family businesses built on trust, and they use that trust to take everything. I have documents from my own father's study, and I'm not the only family who has them. She paused, letting it sit. He spent 3 days telling you who I am. So I'll tell you myself, I'm someone who was almost used, who found out in time, and who is done being quiet about it. She looked at the cameras a moment longer. If anyone else has a story like mine, you're not alone, and you're not crazy. The man crying on your television is very good at his job. His job is making people doubt themselves. She stepped back. No tears, no collapse. She didn't take questions. The clips ran everywhere within the hour, and the wind shifted. She wasn't the runaway bride anymore. She was the woman who'd looked straight into the lens and refused to flinch. The 2 boutiques called back. The magazine reconsidered. And somewhere she knew Brandon was watching his careful story develop a crack. Back in the suite, Riker handed her a glass of water the way he had that first night. How does it feel? He asked. Cassidy almost laughed. Terrifying and good, both at once. That's usually how the right things feel. Her phone buzzed. A block number, she answered, and a thin, frightened voice spoke before she could say a word. You said other families, on the news. You said you weren't the only one. A pause. I have records, real ones. But you have to come to me, and you have to come now, before I lose my nerve. Cassidy looked up at Riker, her heart pounding. Where? She asked. The voice on the phone belonged to a man named Gerald Pratt. He told them little before hanging up. Only a place, a town, and a plea to hurry. Aspen, Colorado, a mountain resort tucked high in the trees where, he said, no one from the old group would ever look for him. They flew out the next morning. The higher the plane climbed, the more the world turned white and sharp below, until they landed in a valley ringed by snow-dusted peaks. The air was thin and bright and cold enough to sting. Gerald had picked the resort well. It was quiet, half empty between seasons, the kind of place where a nervous man could watch the door from a corner table and see anyone coming. He was already there when they arrived, in a large restaurant with tall windows and a fire crackling in a stone hearth. He was older than Cassidy expected, silver-haired, with the soft hands of a man who'd spent his life around money rather than work. He had the same look Walter Boyd had worn, the look of someone who'd been afraid for so long it had become his natural expression. "You came," he said, as if he hadn't believed they would. "You called," Cassidy said gently, sitting across from him. Riker took the chair beside her, quiet, letting her lead. Gerald's hands shook around his coffee. "I almost didn't. I've spent 2 years pretending I never knew any of them." He glanced at the door, then back. "I was an investor, a real one at first. I put my own money in because the deals looked good. By the time I understood what they actually were, I was in too deep to walk away cleanly. So I stayed, and I watched." "You watched them take companies," Riker said. "I watched them take families." Gerald's voice dropped. "There was a couple in Tennessee, trucking, good people. The husband let one of these men marry his sister, thinking it was a blessing. Within a year, the company was gone, and the marriage was a courtroom war. The man walked away rich and called himself the wronged party." He shook his head slowly. "I have the paperwork from 3 deals, wire transfers, signatures, the false promises in writing. I kept copies because I thought someday I might need to protect myself." Cassidy leaned forward. "Then give them to us. Please. With those, we can." "No," Gerald pulled back, sudden and frightened. "I've seen what happens to people who talk. I called you in a moment of nerve, watching you on that television. But now I'm here, and I'm thinking clearly, and I can't. They'll know it was me. I have grandchildren." His hands trembled harder. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called." He started to rise. "Mr. Pratt!" Cassidy's voice stopped him. She didn't reach for him, didn't push. She just spoke quietly the way she might to a friend. 3 days before my wedding, my father told everyone I was marrying a fine young man. I believed it. I picked out flowers. I was going to wear my grandmother's veil." She let the words settle. "And the morning of the wedding, I heard the man I loved laugh and call me a soft girl with a nice inheritance, in front of his friends, like I was a transaction he'd closed." Gerald slowly sat back down. "I know what it's like," she went on, "to find out the people you trusted were running numbers on your life. To feel stupid for not seeing it. To wonder if speaking up will only make you a bigger target." She held his eyes. "You're afraid because you have grandchildren. I understand that. But those families in Tennessee and Ohio, all the others, they had children too. And no one stood up for them, because everyone who knew was as afraid as you are right now." The fire popped in the hearth. Gerald stared down at his shaking hands. "You said you kept the copies to protect yourself," Cassidy said softly. "What if protecting yourself and protecting them turned out to be the same thing? They can't hurt a man who's already told the truth in public. Secrets give them power. Daylight takes it away." For a long moment, Gerald said nothing. The fire crackled. Outside, snow drifted past the tall windows, slow and silent. Then slowly he reached into the worn leather bag at his feet and set a thick envelope on the table. 3 deals, he said. His voice was thin but steadier now. "Everything I kept. Wire records, signed agreements, the promises they made in writing and never meant to keep. It proves the pattern, the same method, the same men, over and over." Cassidy's heart pounded as Riker reached out and slid the envelope toward himself, careful, like it might break. "There's one more thing," Gerald said. "I never had the master records, the real ledger that tracks where all the money finally landed. Only one man kept that." He swallowed. "We called him the investor, Harlan. Kept the second set of books, the ones that tie every deal to the people at the top. With my papers, you have the pattern. With Harlan's ledger, you'd have the whole structure, every name." Riker went very still. Harlan, you're sure of the name. As sure as I am of anything. Gerald rose, slower this time, the weight of 2 years lifting just slightly off his shoulders. I've done what I can. The rest is yours. He left first, alone, slipping out a side door into the snow. Cassidy looked at the envelope, then at Riker. It's not the whole thing, but it's the pattern. It's enough to start. It's enough to make Brandon and his partners very nervous, Riker said. He tucked the envelope inside his coat. There's a business conference in New York next week. Investors, press, the whole industry in one room. Brandon's group always shows up there to look respectable. A hard light came into his eyes. What if, this time, the truth showed up too? Cassidy felt the war turn one final time toward its end. Then let's give them a conference they'll never forget, she said. New York swallowed them whole. The conference filled a glass tower in the heart of the city. 3 days of panels and handshakes where the country's investors and business families gathered to look impressive for one another. Brandon's group would be there, polished and smiling, hunting for the next trusting family to befriend. Cassidy had a different plan for them. In the week before, she and Riker had moved fast and quiet. Gerald's documents went to 2 independent financial experts, people with no connection to Riker's world, who studied the wire transfers and signed agreements and confirmed what Walter and Gerald had said. The same method, the same handful of men, repeated across 3 states. A pattern on paper that no crying interview could explain away. The conference organizers had a closing session each year, open to press, where industry figures spoke. Cassidy requested a slot under the lane name. Her family's company was old and respected enough that no one thought to question it. They put her on the schedule as a young heiress, giving remarks about family business. She was going to give them a great deal more than that. The morning of, she stood backstage in a deep green dress, the 2 financial experts beside her, a slim folder in her hands. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see the audience filling the room, and there, near the front, was Brandon. He'd come to be seen. He sat with 2 older men in expensive suits, laughing softly, completely at ease. He doesn't know, she whispered. No, Riker said. He stood in the shadows where the cameras wouldn't find him, exactly as he'd promised. Walk out there and finish it. Her name was called. Cassidy walked into the lights. She set her folder on the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. For one heartbeat, the old fear rose. The urge to shrink, to be small and grateful, she pushed it down. Good afternoon, she said. Many of you came expecting remarks about family business, so that's what I'll give you. Specifically, how to destroy one. A ripple of confused interest moved through the room. Brandon's smile flickered. There is a method, she continued, her voice clear and unhurried. You find a healthy company, family-owned, built on trust. You send in a partner, sometimes a fiancé. The relationship opens doors that contracts never could. Once your family, you borrow against the company, drain its value, and move the debt around until the original owners are left with nothing but the name. Then you walk away, and if anyone asks, you call yourself the victim. The room had gone very quiet. I know this method, she said, because 3 weeks ago I almost became part of it. She turned to the screen behind her. The first document appeared, enlarged for everyone to see. The partnership proposal from her father's study, her own name in the middle of it, the cheap investment that would have handed Lane Retail's factories to a man with empty pockets. This is real, from my own father's desk. She nodded to one of the experts, who stepped forward and confirmed, in dry professional terms, exactly what the numbers meant. Brandon shifted in his seat. The 2 men beside him had stopped smiling. The next documents came up. Gerald's records, names redacted where they had to be, but the wire transfers and signed agreements plain. 3 other families, the trucking company in Tennessee, A textile maker in Ohio. The same structure each time, the same fingerprints. 3 families that I can prove, Cassidy said. There are more. They were afraid to speak. Because the men who did this are very good at making honest people feel like the crazy ones. She looked directly at Brandon now, the whole room following her eyes to him. One of them is sitting in this room. Every head turned. Brandon's face had gone the color of paper. He stood halfway up. This is slander, he said, too loud. She left me at the altar. She's bitter. She's making things up too. These are notarized findings from 2 independent analysts who have never met me or anyone I work with, Cassidy said calmly, lifting the folder. You're welcome to read them yourself. They're being released to the press as I speak. The 2 men beside Brandon were no longer looking at him. One was already easing away, the way people move from something they don't want to be standing near. I'm not bitter, Cassidy went on, steady as stone. I was lucky. I heard the truth in a hallway with 3 minutes to spare. Most of the people in these documents weren't that lucky. They lost everything believing they'd gained a son, a partner, a friend. She closed the folder. I'm only here so the next family hears it before they sign, not after. She stepped back from the podium. The room erupted. Reporters were on their feet, phones up, the financial experts already surrounded. Brandon stood frozen in the storm, abandoned by the men he'd come with, watching 2 years of careful image work collapse around him in real time. He looked toward the stage, searching for her, and for one moment their eyes met. She felt nothing. No anger, no triumph, no fear. Just the clean, light feeling of a door finally closing. Backstage, Riker was waiting in the shadows. You didn't flinch, he said. I wanted to, she admitted. I just didn't let it show. By that evening, the story was everywhere, and this time it wasn't about a runaway bride. It was about a scheme and the families it had hurt, and the woman who'd dragged it into the light. Investors pulled out of Brandon's holdings within hours. His company, already hollow, had nothing left to hide behind. The victim mask was gone, and underneath it, the public finally saw the empty thing that had worn it. Cassidy stood at the window of yet another tall building, watching the city glow, and realized she wasn't running from anything anymore. But one name still sat unfinished in the back of her mind. Harlan, the ledger. The man at the top was still out there. 3 months later, the ocean wind smelled like salt and new beginnings. Cassidy stood in front of a renovated waterfront warehouse in Newport, Rhode Island, watching a crew hang the final letters above the entrance. Her own name wasn't on it. The lane name wasn't either. The sign read a single word she'd chosen herself. Cassidy and CO, made for everybody. It was her own label. Not a branch of her family's company. Not a favor built on the lane name. She'd started it from nothing in those 3 months, with her own savings and a small loan she'd earned on her own merit. Designing clothes for women who'd spent their whole lives being told they were too soft, too round, too much. Women like the one she used to apologize for being. The launch event was that evening, and people were actually coming. After New York, everything had changed. Brandon's company had collapsed entirely once the investors fled. He'd vanished from the public eye, no longer the wounded fiancé, just a man whose story everyone now knew. The families in Gerald's documents had found each other through the press, coverage, and several were pursuing what they'd lost through proper channels, no longer alone, no longer doubting themselves. And Harlan, the investor, the man who'd kept the master ledger, Riker had handled that thread the way he handled things in his world. Quietly, thoroughly, in places Cassidy never saw and didn't ask about. A month after New York, he'd told her only that the ledger had surfaced, that the right people had it now, and that the structure above Brandon had come apart at the top. The man who'd built the method would never run it again. She'd decided not to ask for the details. Some things she trusted Riker to carry so she didn't have to. Her parents arrived early to the launch. Her father pulled her into a long hug, and when he stepped back, his eyes were wet. "I trusted him," he said quietly. "I almost cost you everything because I trusted the wrong man and didn't tell you the truth." "You trusted him because you trust everyone, Dad," Cassidy said. "That's not a flaw, it's just a door he found. I closed it." She squeezed his hand. "We're all still here, that's what matters." The evening filled the warehouse with light and music and people. Buyers, press, women who'd followed her story and wanted to wear something made by the heiress who'd refused to flinch. The clothes moved fast off the racks. By the time the speeches were done, she'd taken more orders than she'd dared to hope for. Her own success, built on her own name, standing on its own. It was late when she finally slipped out the back, onto the wooden deck that overlooked the dark water. The party still glowed behind her. The ocean stretched out ahead, black and endless under a sky full of stars. She heard footsteps and didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You came," she said, echoing Gerald's words from a snowy lodge a lifetime ago. "You invited me." Riker came to stand beside her at the rail. He looked different here, in the soft light off the water. The hard edges she'd met in the back of an SUV had quieted. He wasn't a protector tonight, wasn't an investigator, wasn't a man with a world full of shadows. He was just here because she'd wanted him to be. "It's strange," she said, looking out at the sea. 3 months ago I climbed into the wrong car in a wedding dress, terrified, with no plan and no idea who you were. I thought it was the worst mistake of my life. And now I think it might have been the only thing that saved me." She laughed softly. "If I'd picked any other car, if you'd been 30 seconds down the road, I'd have married him. I'd have lost everything slowly, year by year, and never even known it was happening." She turned to face him. One wrong door turned out to be the right one. Riker was quiet for a moment, the wind moving his hair. "You know what I expected that morning," he said. "A frightened girl I'd drop somewhere safe and forget. Instead, I found someone who walked into every hard room I put her in and walked out stronger than she went in. You didn't need a protector, Cassidy. You needed about 3 days to remember what you already were." She felt something warm and steady settle in her chest. Not the dizzy, desperate feeling Brandon had once given her, the kind built on being chosen, on being grateful. This was different. This was being seen fully by someone who wanted nothing from her but her company. "What happens now?" she asked. "Your world, my world, they don't exactly match." "They don't," he agreed. "But I've spent my whole life living in the space between two worlds. I'm good at it." He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the way she'd come to know. "I'm not asking for anything tonight. I just didn't want to be anywhere else." It was, somehow, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. She turned back to the water and let her shoulder rest lightly against his. He didn't move away. The ocean rolled in and out below them, patient and certain, and the party glowed warm at her back, full of a future she'd built with her own hands. She thought about the girl in the bridal suite who'd torn off her veil and run, with no idea where she was going. She wished she could tell her, "Keep running. The wrong door is up ahead, and it leads somewhere right." "Thank you," she said quietly, "for stopping the car, for all of it." "Thank you," Riker said, "for getting in." Above them the stars held steady, and below them the sea kept its old, hopeful rhythm. And Cassidy stood at the edge of the life she'd chosen for herself, no longer running, finally home.